So I want to end this lecture by pointing to another line of criticism that people might offer up against reliabilist theories or against my defense of reliabilism against BonJour's counterexamples. And these fall under the general rubric in the literature of the generality problem. Now, in my own work, I don't refer to it as the generality problem, I refer to it as the characterization problem, precisely because that's what it's about. It's about how do we go about characterizing a process that generates a belief in order to evaluate its reliability. So people often suppose that you can defend reliabilism, as I've done, precisely because of the vague and unprincipled way in which reliabilists characterize processes. Now you might think, well, actually it seems like this is the opposite of that. It seems like BonJour has characterized his processes very vaguely and in a very unprincipled way, and that what we've done is gone through and given much more precise characterizations and considered alternative different ways of characterizing these processes. So we've been much more specific, much more principled, much more concrete. Nevertheless, though, people will say, well, look, when you've got a case of a belief being formed, do you characterize that process in terms of that single instance? Do you characterize that process in terms of its neurophysiological basis? Do you characterize that process in terms of the day of the week? So this is the process that I used at 9:43 on Tuesday morning. What's the way in which you should characterize processes in order to evaluate their reliability? And Coney and Feldman make this criticism of reliabilist theories generally. So they claim in their paper, for example, from 1998, that a fully articulated reliabilist theory must identify with sufficient clarity the nature of the processes that it invokes. In doing so, the theory confronts what has come to be known as the generality problem. And again, the generality problem, as they understand it, is just how do you characterize a process? Now, Coney and Feldman specifically, and in general in the literature, they associate how you characterize a process with also specifying the set of alternatives that you use to evaluate its reliability. So when you characterize a process, you also characterize all the cases in which it gets used. I separate these out, but that's how it's normally understood. So you imagine a case like this, where you're going to identify a tree, you look at that tree, it's got ridges on its leaves, it's got 0 sharp or rounded points on its leaves, and so you identify it as an elm. How should we characterize this process? Now, it seems like if we look at the functioning of the visual system when I identify different trees based on my knowledge of the kinds of leaves they have, I could come up with a bunch of different characterizations. And the question is, which one is the one that I should use in order to understand and evaluate that belief-forming process? So for instance, I might characterize a process very specifically in terms of whether or not it has sharp points and how many sharp points it has. So I might characterize a process that allows me to identify maples in isolation from all my other categorization of trees. So if it has sharp points and they're greater than or equal to 5, then it's a maple. I might characterize that same process more generally in terms of one that looks at the number of points or ridges and then maps that onto maples. Or I might characterize it as the number of points, ridges, and types of point to maple. The number of points, ridges, and whether or not they're sharp to maple or to elm. The number of points, ridges, sharp, rounded to maple, to elm, or to oak. I could just characterize it as a visual categorization process. I could categorize it as a visual categorization behind obstructions process. So there are lots of different ways I could describe that process. The question is there a preferred description of that process in virtue of which I'm capable of coming up with an objective assessment of that process's reliability? And so people like Feldman will say, look, the proposal for the specification of processes has to be principled. A solution must be universal only in that it must specify the relevant type wherever there are definite facts about justification. So in other words, if I'm ever looking at situations where I've got justified beliefs, then I must be able to come up with this general principled way of characterizing processes that gives me an answer about what the process is in those cases. In addition to that, they think that the types have to be, in addition to that, they think that the types that you identify with this general means of characterization have to have a reliability that's plausibly correlated with the justification of the resulting beliefs. And they think that a solution cannot identify the relevant type for a process in a way that merely smuggles in non-reliabilist epistemic evaluation into the characterization of relevant types of processes. So how you understand a particular process, that will determine in part how you assess its reliability. And so this is a real challenge that reliabilist theories have to address. And some people think that it is, in fact, not a problem that can be solved. I personally think that that would be very strange. What it would really suggest is that we couldn't do psychology, that we could never come up with descriptions of psychological processes that were agreed upon as the correct descriptions of those processes. And that seems kind of strange. So lots of processes would likely be ruled out just right off the top. The process that I used at 9:53 on Tuesday, that just doesn't seem like a relevant way of identifying processes. The neurophysiological characterizations might be more relevant, but our process also has to take into account its information processing features too. So it's not just what neurons get activated when, it's what neurons represent when they're activated and how that information gets utilized. So there's definitely work to be done in this area, but theorists disagree about the likelihood of as to whether or not people could really do this for psychological processes in the way that would be illuminating for the purposes of epistemology.